Thank you all. We're starting 5 minutes late, so just make sure you give us 5 minutes at the end. Just to sort of add to that introduction, Professor Assadi is a very well-known political scientist in Karnataka. Briefly, he was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Mysore. He follows political developments in Karnataka and nationally very, very closely, and is a favorite of journalists like me because he has the ability to theorize very quickly, which is a great advantage, to sort of see things in long-term perspective and to provide a very sort of cogent analysis that helps in understanding the situation. So, Professor Muzaffar Assadi wrote this book. This book was published 2 years ago. In Kannada, the title is Alpasankhyaataru Mattu Jati Vyavasthe, Asmite Vasahatu Shahi Mattu Misalati, which translates to minorities and caste system, identity, colonialism, and reservation. An extended translation of this book was published, Colonial and Post-Colonial Identity Politics in South Asia, Zat/Caste among Muslims. This is just published, so we'll be discussing this book. My first question, Professor Assadi. So you've written a book on a fairly provocative theme, because theologically at least, Islam sees itself as very different from Hinduism. One of the key essences of Hinduism is caste. In fact, some scholars have argued that without caste, there is no Hinduism. And one of Islam's fundamental tenets is that everyone is equal before Allah. So theoretically, at least, there should be no space for social stratification within the praxis of Islam. But your book argues for this pervasive and deep presence of caste among Indian Muslims. Can you briefly explain this?
Yeah, Vikhar, first of all, thanks to this Bangalore Literature Festival for inviting me. Most important thing is that recognizing me. Otherwise, what Charles Taylor says that definitely will be marginalized. We are unknown. We don't have our own identity as such. The second important thing is that we need to understand the context in which I could able to interrogate this issue. In fact, when I started writing this book, it was the time of COVID. COVID provided me the time required to write this book. Because that it was a time when nobody would intervene in my day-to-day life, except my missus, who is here, who is supportive of me, and my daughter, and also son. Whatever it may be. It was in my background, it was in my mind that I should write something on caste among the Muslims because of my personal reasons. I'll come back to that one later on. Most important thing is that Islam as a Semitic religion, which never believed in the caste identities or as scripture identities, as in the theological form also. That is a major question. In fact, I went through some of the important texts. There are, even in the case of the Islam, there are different kind of arguments. You have an argument about the political Islam. There are people like Veena Das, they've been arguing that there's something called the folk Islam. Is it possible to construct something called the folk Islam? Or Akbar Ahmed, he calls it as the tribal Islam. Argument is that when Islam moved to, spread to the different parts of the world, particularly to the Afghanistan and other area, it did not destroy the, social structure. Rather than it compromised, rather it co-opted some of the social structures, some of the social values, social relations, and try to coexist with that one. That's the reason why in tribal areas like Afghanistan, we still have these two practices, the tribal practices and Islamic practices. They're coexisting. So like even the case of the folk Islam. So folk Islam is that Islam which, which has taken the, appropriated the nativity or the cultural practice of the locality. So you've got I would call it as something called the hybrid Islam. It's a kind of hybridity. Or they take the case of when Islam moved to Caribbean countries. So you got, it's something called the hybridity where it negotiated with the local culture, with the, theology. And also there are references to in the text, like for example, like the home, or even there are references to the different social structures like the slaves, military men and other things, or even the argument of the Ibn Sina and others. We definitely said that there are diversity within the Islam as a social practice, as a theology also. So definitely we need to recognize this diversity. So that made me to get into the issues of the caste. When Islam moved to the India, I'll come back to that argument. What are the forms in which the Islam came to India? Was it only by conquest or the different forms? Why syncretic culture becomes most important or the Sufism become most important? Because the Sufism did not, documented or numbered the caste that have been, converted or they have been, become what's called the Islamic. In fact, Sufism was seen as a deviant religion up till, I think, the 10th century. Post-10th century, it was seen as a part of Islam. But now that is being treated as in Indian context, as a part of the syncretic culture, whatever it may be. But my argument is that a religion, Semitic religion, when it moved to the different parts of the world, it is not only to Islam alone, even the Christianity. Christianity, appropriated or even it negotiated the local culture, social structures. So you've got a category called the Dalit Christians, Dalit Muslims, or Paswanda Muslims and other things. I'll come back to that one. Or you have got the, Buddhism, appropriating. Different religions, when it negotiated with the social structure of the locality, definitely has, taken into account these kind of social structures. Islam, yes, it has done it. There are, my argument is that there are historians like Ziauddin Barani, or even Al-Biruni also makes reference to these social structures that have been, adopted. Even, for example, like the Akbar's Din-e-Ilahi, Akbar, categorized, identified one category called the Halal Core, which are nothing but the Dalits as a specific category. And also, Din-e-Ilahi also talks about different social categories existed. So you got the multiple Islam on side. Like, if you refer to Akbar Ahmed like tribal Islam, or you got a folk Islam, then you got a political Islam and other things. So that's the reason why I try to understand this, caste structure. Is it possible to identify the caste? But the only thing is that who documented? The two important questions that we need to understand. One is that when did this caste social structure enter into the Islamic faith? Unlike the Hindu social practices, where the caste is identified with the imagined past, post-Vedic period kind of things. But in Islam, there is a specific time period, like post 7th century, when Islam moved to India, when it came to India through different way, like from trade, in the form of trade, or in the form of what's called the Sufis, or in the form of other ways. There are many ways that it came to India.
Professor, if I could follow up with another question. I think because we have limited time, let me try and get as many questions as I can so that we cover different aspects of your book. I was curious to understand, you've sort of gone ahead, argued that caste exists among Indian Muslims. We know how caste manifests in Hindu society, but how does caste manifest among Muslims? Is it endogamy? Is it food habits? Is it discrimination? What does it mean?
Well, when compared to the Hindu social practices, the caste among the Muslims are slightly different.
Huh.
Sometimes it's overlapping also. Like, for example, it does believe in the hierarchical social structure. Like, for example, Sayyids are at the top of the social hierarchy. Or the caste like the Pindas or Chapparbans. Pindas were the criminal tribes. There was a time when they were treated as criminal tribes. Or you got Chapparbans or Pindas, Julaha, and all these categories. They are at the lower
Julahas are weavers.
Yeah,
So Chapparbans are?
the 10 pictures.
10 pictures.
Yeah,
Okay.
10 pictures. Pindas were the criminals. This is one category that the colonialists created. See, likewise, in the Britishers, they created other categories. So there are mistakes that they committed, particularly in the context of the enumeration. Enumeration became the biggest politics that they, resorted to. Enumeration created the numbering, the majority, minority, dominant, non-dominant, backward, forward kind of categories. Even enumeration also, documented even the single caste also. But enumeration also made a mistake. For example, while enumerating, documenting, they made the mistake of spelling mistakes. One small mistake would, change the caste position of a category. Like, for example, mir. A dot in the mir, because, they were, documenting in Urdu. That small dot displays the Hindu mir to Muslim mir. So Hindu becomes a Muslim just because of the mistake.
Where is this? In which part of the country?
That's the northern part.
Okay. But I think you digressed. I was interested in understanding how does caste manifest? Do people not marry with each other? Say
That's right. And see, there are many things. See, if we go by the documents, there are many things. One is that the endogamy that they followed. The second important thing is the caste practices. For example, in Bengal, there is a caste which believed in the spirits.
The spirits?
Yeah, the spirits. They worshipping the nature, and they also command the Islam. So you have got these kind of, who have been treated as the, marginalized or treated as a very backward among the Muslims. So I got a category. In fact, the Bengal census in 1901, much before that one, you got somebody called ethnographer like Risley, divided the Muslims into three important broad categories. Ashrafs as the upper caste, Arzals and the Urzals. So either they are belong to the OBC categories or the scheduled tribes, scheduled caste categories. Even the scheduled tribes also converted to the Islam. That we need to understand. So these categories, there is a kind of hierarchical structure. But one thing quite obvious, if you read some of the census like Baroda or the Gwalior census, you find the flexibility within the Muslims as a community. For example, like I have referred to in my book, saying that this year you might be Julaha or you might be what's called the Pindas. Next year you can become a Sheikh by virtue of the money power. Next year you can become, Sayeed. So you can go up in the ladder, which is not permissible in the Hindu society. So,
I think this is the process that you called Ashrafization.
Exactly. That's an Ashrafization, which is very close to the Sanskritization process. That's
of M.N. Srinivas.
M.N. Srinivas.
But I think the distinction lies, like you said, in Hinduism, while you can aspire to go higher up the social ladder by mimicking the rituals of the upper caste, you can't actually change your caste. Whereas in Islam, at least the way it has operated in South Asia, you have provided examples where this process of Ashrafization has been successful.
Exactly. But that's going to be a kind of hybrid kind of thing. There is nothing called the pure caste among the Muslims. For example, if you say that Sheikhs or the Sayyid, they are the descendants of the Prophet, or they are from the Central Asia or even the Middle East. But in fact, they were also converted from the local caste. So you got these, for example, like the Pinjas. Pinjas, they might be having the title called the Sheikhs, but they are not the pure Sheikhs. They are not the descendant of the Arab stocks, but rather they are the descendant of the local caste communities. So you got a hybrid communities here.
No, from what I understand also from since your sources are mainly colonial sources like the census, gazetteers, police records, etc., what perhaps were nebulous, sort of cloudy hybrid identities in the 19th century became more pure Islamic identities, I think. And then caste also was a fact as the British tried to understand the colonized, the Indian society. Is that something that sort of worries you, or sort of it's a tricky question, but this creation of knowledge maybe also created the idea of caste?
Well, in the process of what's called creating the knowledge about in the local communities in Indian context, colonialism did create these categories. If you look at the way they constructed the categories, like for example, the way the criminal tribes were constructed, it's a political construct. Or take the case of the category called the Asiatic the Muslims, or non-Asiatic Muslims, or Azraels and Arzals kind of categories, or warmongering categories. There are these categories, they were all politically constructed. It is not simply the construction from within the community, but rather it's all political construct. So the one side, the colonialism wanted to have the knowledge about the communities in India, because it is quite obvious that they wanted to control India. This is one part of controlling India, hegemonizing India by virtue of understanding the social structure. But at the same time, they try to understand the diversity, whether the biodiversity or other things, and try to and not only to understand but also to control, dominate, and also divide the Muslims or divide the Hindus and the Muslims. But in the process, what they did was they even documented a single man belongs to one particular caste. Interestingly, these categories existed. I'm referring to Arjuna Apaduri's argument. They at the same time they were existed but not enlisted in sometimes. But in fact, they were enlisted in the documentation in the census reports. But unfortunately, they were left out in the subsequent census report. So that's the reason why, for example, the argument about Dadekullas in the what's called Kurg province, or Enne Goliga. So these are the two categories which existed, which were enlisted, but suddenly they disappear. So you got many categories who are not being recognized now. So that I'm going back to the argument of Charles Taylor again, to understand why these categories suddenly disappear. Had they not been recognized, they would have been, in the mainstream of the politics, or they would have been, co-opted in the politics itself.
Okay. I'm just going to ask you one last question, slightly more difficult because it pertains to contemporary times. In an earlier conversation with me, you said that Muslims must reclaim their caste identities and lobby, at least for the sake of appropriating political dividends, or else they will remain subalterns forever. So by political dividends, you clearly mean lobby for reservation. But, we are living in a milieu where Indian Muslims are facing severe challenges, and that any demand for reservation will be treated, it's almost treated disdainfully, like an illegitimate demand, right? I mean, that's perhaps one of the failures of Indian democracy, that various backward and lower castes among Hindu society can keep bargaining and lobbying for reservation, but whereas Muslim demand will be treated as illegitimate. We saw that, how peremptorily the 4% reservation provided for Muslims in Karnataka was taken away by the BJP government just before the elections earlier this year. So what is your response? I mean, you say that Muslims must reclaim their caste identities, but then it seems very, very difficult. Yeah.
It's not difficult, but it's easy to come out with the argument. For example, when government of Karnataka abolished this 4%, particularly those who are getting the benefit in 2B category, the whole argument was that the Muslims are a religious category. I said that they are not the religious category, but also they are socially economic category as well. Look at the category 1. There are, in category 1, you have got the Muslims also. There are Muslim caste. Pinjas are there, Nadaf are there, and others. There are many categories there, which obviously means that it has recognized the caste one side. But on the other hand, it was also, de-recognizing the Muslims as a homogeneous group. But I would say that had, our, what's called the commissions and others, they had come out with the list of Muslims, including myself, Assadis. Assadis are nowhere in the backward class commission report. I have not seen anywhere. Or Ansaris, Jolahs, Sheikhs, or take Sharifs, or anybody for that matter. We don't have the list. So that's the reason why argument is that Muslims are the homogeneous group. And religious-based arguments. So, but if you look at the reports, whether it's a Havanur committee report, or the Venkataswamy committee report, or Nagan Gowda committee report, or even Rangnath Mishra committee report, or Saja committee report, it says that there exists caste among the Muslims as a socio-economic category. It is not the religion which is the major important. If that is the argument taken, then obviously why the Indian government has given the reservation to the Buddhists and the Sikhs. Even though there is a presidential proclamation in 1950 that other than the Hindus, no other communities should be given on the basis of reservation on the basis of the religion. But Muslims are denied. We should go back to the debate of the Constituent Assembly, whatever it may be. But the thing is that we need to understand Muslims as a socio-economic categories. They're being treated as the OBCs. For example, if you go back to I think 1874, Old Mysore was the first state to recognize the Muslims as a part of the depressed classes. So you've got a long history. You cannot remove this history from your imagination. Suddenly you cannot remove them from these categories, from this list. So I insist that they should reclaim the caste. So that's the reason, for the political reasons, not the social reasons, for the political reasons, to get the benefits. Because affirmative action would lead you to be a part of the political process, lead you to be a part of the power structure. Otherwise, what happens is that the community will remain backward. You take the case of the Sacha committee report. Sacha committee reports give the statistics of the statistics, saying that Muslims are literally backward. Given the fact that even after 60 years, 70 years, majority of the Muslims, they live in slum areas or ghettos. They don't have any representation in many of the sectors, except in the informal sector. Or take the case of, Leslie Miller Committee report in 1920s, and take the Rahman Khan Committee report in Karnataka in 2005 somewhere. If you go back to the Leslie Miller Committee report, you would have said that Muslims should have been, fairly represented, and they have been highly developed and other things. But if you go back to the argument of Rahman Khan Committee report, it gives a very, very dismal, progress of the Muslim community. Yes. We don't have a PhDs. The percentage of PhDs among the Muslims is 0.001%. The doctors, 0.01%. How do you look at this community? And they still live in the ghettos.
Thank you. So you make a forceful argument.